the nervous and endocrine systems. B1, the nervous system. So the two main divisions of the nervous system are the central nervous system, or CNS, and the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. Central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the peripheral nervous system includes the sensory motor neurons that connect the central nervous system to the rest of the body. Neurons. The scientific name for the nerve cell is a neuron. It has an axon, which is a long nerve fibre of a neuron which carries a nerve impulse. Dendrites, extensions from the cell body which connect with neighbouring neurons. Schwann cells, specialised cells associated with the axons with myelinated neurons, and forms the insulated myelin sheath. The myelin sheath is a fatty insulating layer around some axons produced by Schwann cells. The nodes of Ranvier are the gaps between Schwann cells that enable saltatory conduction, and a motor neuron sends impulses from the spinal cord or CNS to the effector, which can be a muscle or gland. So a motor neuron sends impulses from the spinal cord or CNS to the effector, muscle or gland. So you usually have the cell body at one end, the axon goes towards the motor end plate and the skeletal muscle or the gland. Sensory neuron sends impulses from a sensory receptor to a relay neuron in the spinal cord or CNS, and it tends to have the cell body in the middle. And then relay neurons carry messages from one part of the CNS to another, and they're a lot more highly branched, a lot more synaptic endings and dendrites. Reflex arc. Receptor is a specialised cell that responds to changes in the surrounding environment. Effector is a muscle or gland. Action potential is a change in electrical impulse potential along the membrane of a nerve or muscle cell, commonly known as a nerve impulse. Glial cell is a cell that provides support for neurons. Reflex arc goes stimulus, receptor, sensory neuron, relay neuron, motor neuron, and effector, and that carries out the response. And they are quick. They are involved in a quick response to trigger an action potential. The pathway is a lot shorter because, although the brain will find out afterwards, it doesn't need to be needed for the response to happen. Action potential is a neural impulse. A brief electrical charge travels down an axon. So you've got, at resting, one, there is a sodium potassium pump, a carrier pump that uses ATP to actively transport 3 sodium ions out of the cell and 2 potassium ions into the cell. And resting potential at 1 is the state of a neuron when not firing a neural impulse. The neuron is polarized and the negative inside, so it's minus 70 millivolts. Depolarization, when stimulated, voltage-gated sodium channels open, more sodium ions diffuse into the neuron, so it makes the inside of the membrane positive, goes up to plus 35 millivolts, and then it gets repolarized at 3. Sodium channels close, potassium voltage-gated channels become activated and open, causing potassium to diffuse out of the cell membrane to repolarize. And then there's a bit of hyperpolarization at 4, where potassium ions are closed to channels are slow to close, so there's a slight overshoot where too many potassium ions diffuse out of the neurons. The potential difference is more negative from resting potential. Refractory period is the time following an action potential during which a new action potential cannot be initiated. Myelinated axons are axons covered with myelin sheath with gaps between them, or nodes of Ranvier. Transmission is much faster. Saltatory conduction is rapid transmission of a nerve impulse along an axon, resulting from the action potential jumping from one node of Ranvier to another, skipping the myelin sheath regions of the membrane. So, role of synapses, a summary. Role is to transmit signals, pass electrical impulses between neurons or from neurons to effectors, and it happens via a chemical that diffuses, a neurotransmitter that diffuses. They ensure one-way transmission. Neurotransmitters are only released from the presynaptic neuron. They allow integration. Multiple synapses allow signals from different sources to be processed. Filter signals prevent weak signals from being passed on unless threshold is reached. They enable summation, combine multiple impulses to trigger an action potential, so either spatial or temporal. There are lots of neurons synapsing with another neuron, or temporal more action potentials in a certain amount of time. They permit inhibition. Inhibitory synapses reduce the likelihood of an action potential in the postsynaptic cell. Control signal cell strength, frequency of impulses affects how many neurotransmitter is released. So here we've got a synapse, we've got the presynaptic knob, presynaptic membrane. In the presynaptic knob, you've got mitochondria and vesicles which contain acetylcholine, and the impulse will arrive at the end of the presynaptic knob. That will cause vesicles containing acetylcholine to be the acetylcholine to be released into cleft in response to the impulse reaching the end of the presynaptic knob. That'll diffuse across the synaptic cleft, which is the gap between them, and then the acetylcholine will bind with receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, acetylcholine receptors, and then that will open sodium channels and trigger an action potential in the postsynaptic neuron. So the presynaptic neuron conducts impulses towards the synapse. The synaptic vesicles are membrane-bound compartments in which synthesized neurotransmitters are kept. Neurotransmitters are chemical messengers that cross the synaptic gaps between neurons. Mitochondria, an organelle found in large numbers in the presynaptic neuron to provide ATP to synthesize neurotransmitters. The synaptic cleft is a tiny gap that separates the axon terminal of one neuron from the dendrite terminal of the next neuron. How neurotransmitters work: they are released, then diffuse across the synaptic cleft. They bind to receptors in the postsynaptic neuron. If enough neurotransmitter binds, an action potential will be generated in the postsynaptic neuron. Synaptic transmission steps: there is depolarization of the presynaptic membrane. This causes calcium channels to open. Calcium ions enter the presynaptic knob. This causes vesicles containing the neurotransmitter to move towards and fuse with the presynaptic membrane and release the neurotransmitter or acetylcholine. The acetylcholine then diffuses across the synaptic cleft, attaches to receptors on the postsynaptic membrane, and that causes sodium ions to enter, leading to depolarization. Neurotransmitters and drugs at synapses. So Parkinson's disease is a disorder of the central nervous system that affects movement due to lack of dopamine, often including tremors. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that affects hunger, sleep, arousal, and mood. So a lack of serotonin can cause depression. Nervous system disorders. So multiple sclerosis is an autoimmune demyelinating disease. It affects the central nervous system, brain, and spinal cord. It causes damage to the myelin sheath. Symptoms are fatigue, vision issues, muscle weakness, balance. Progression, often relapsing, remitting, or progressive, and it can cause possible cognitive changes. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, is neurodegenerative motor neuron disease. Motor neurons in the brain and the spinal cord it causes death of the motor neurons. So symptoms are muscle wasting, paralysis, difficulty speaking or swallowing, progressive and usually fatal. Cognitive impact is usually preserved, but some may develop dementia. Hypothalamus, key functions. There's a link between the nervous and endocrine system. It receives signals from the nervous system and controls the pituitary gland, which releases hormones into the bloodstream. Hormone regulation produces releasing or inhibiting hormones that control the anterior pituitary, so TRH, CRH, GnRH. Homeostasis control regulates internal conditions like body temperature, thirst, hunger, sleep, and circadian rhythms. Autonomic nervous system controls involuntary functions like heart rate, blood pressure, and digestion via the autonomic nervous system. Stress response activates the HPA axes, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal, during stress, leading to cortisol release. Suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN, is found in the hypothalamus just above the optic chiasm. Acts as the body's master circadian clock. It regulates daily rhythms like sleep-wake cycle, hormone release, body temperature, receives light signals from the retina to synchronize with day and night, controls melatonin release via the pineal gland. Shift work and circadian disruption health effects. So it can impact the body clock and make it go out of sync and could cause poor sleep quality. It can cause insomnia, daytime sleepiness, shift work, sleep disorder. Hormonal disruption can alter cortisol and melatonin, affect stress and immune function, can cause a higher risk of obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, increased risk of depression, anxiety, and cognitive decline. Long-term disruption may impair DNA repair, increasing cancer risk.